Okay, hello and welcome everybody to the podcast once again. Here we go. We are talking today about quite a number of things. We had a week off last week, so we're a bit behind on some topics. So we thought we'd do a bit of a catch up and close the gap, as it were, regarding all of those things. So, as always, I am joined by my usual co-host, Mr. Vincent Mangan. So we got some supercars news again, lots of supercars news, but we've also got a few Formula One silly season sort of things to talk about as we do during a summer break. What should we start with? Should we do any recap of? I mean, it's been over a week now. Should we recap the last Formula One race at all?
There's a bit of a mention about Oh, we'll talk about it now. The race was typical Spa. The leader. Max just did his thing again. But the point I want to talk about the race is who do you think's at fault for Piastri's first corner incident? Do you think it was his fault, or was it? I think it was Sainz, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was Sainz and Piastri coming together. I mean, obviously the Australian in me wants to say that it was all Sainz's fault and Piastri's completely not to blame. But honestly, it's kind of a racing incident. I think both parties played some part in it. I think Sainz more than Piastri was to blame, mostly because he's just a more experienced driver who's driven that track more often in the same kind of cars. He should know a little bit better than to kind of close that gap going into turn one at Spa. It's always a bit of a dicey corner, and he should have been aware that there was going to be a car there on his inside. I know he was trying to avoid Lewis there, but I don't know. It's one of those sort of very clumsy from Sainz, I think. I don't think there's much Piastri could have done differently, in my eyes, to sort of back out of that. He really had that corner, and Sainz just didn't give him the space he was expecting. Yeah, so a bit clumsy. Really sad for Piastri because he had a really good performance otherwise over the rest of the weekend. But yeah, it kind of got soured pretty quickly in the main race there.
My logic behind it is technically that was 3 going into 1. Everybody knows if you're on the inside on that corner, you're going to go for the inside. I felt that maybe Sainz was a bit too hot-footed going in. But like you said, I put it down to a racing incident. I believe that, situational awareness should have been paramount for them because, at the end of the day, it's Spa. First corner's a hairpin. If it goes through cleanly, that's sweet. If not, usually it ends up like a game of Skittles. Everybody's everywhere. And we saw that, I think, a few times in Spa. So, yeah, down to a racing incident. Felt bad for Piastri. Like you said, there was nowhere for him to go, really. And Sainz would have ended up in the back of Hamilton if he continued. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's not really a situation where anybody wins that scenario, I don't think. Yeah, it was probably more disappointing to see Sainz kind of putting a lot of heat and blame on Piastri for it, when really should have been able to see his own culpability in that incident, even though it ended up it cost both drivers the race, essentially, because Sainz had to retire, even though he retired much later in the race. He'd really already retired before the end there, so yeah, just a bit of a clumsy start for both of them, but yeah, that was the main action in the main race. We did have I mean, if you want to talk about other incidents during the race that were controversial, we had good old Perez and Hamilton during the sprint race, which was a pretty controversial one. I'm of the opinion that Lewis got shafted there with a penalty. I think that was as big a racing incident as racing incidents are. Like, it was hard racing. It was a bit of Robbins racing, which you don't see as much in Formula One, obviously, because the cars don't really like to bang against each other too much. They're so fragile and so, delicate in their balance, that you don't really see that. And you've never really seen that with Formula One cars. They've never been sort of really close banging each other kind of cars because they're just not built for that. But I thought Lewis had every right. Perez had got a slow exit. He was struggling. He saw an opportunity. He took the gap. The gap was more than enough. He was well alongside. Perez just didn't give it up, and they came in, hit each other. I thought Hamilton getting a penalty for that incident was pretty rough. Honestly, despite, I mean, it's always a thing with penalties that people will talk about. It's like, do you take into account the aftermath of an incident when you're giving the penalty? Like, do they take into account the fact that Perez did end up having to basically fall back a lot, and I think he retired. I can't remember if he retired, but it cost him a race. It cost him a lot because he had a big hole in his sideboard. Do they take that into account when they're giving out the penalty? I don't think they should. I think they should just look at the incident, what happened on track, regardless of the outcome of it. That Perez did end up with a fairly significant amount of damage, and Hamilton didn't end up with much. They shouldn't be taking that too much into account. And I think they maybe did a bit, and that's why he ended up with that 5-second penalty, which in a sprint race was pretty devastating for the result overall. But yeah, I don't know. What's your thoughts on it?
In my thoughts, racing's racing, right? You're gonna bump into other people. You're gonna race hard because at the end of the day, Perez is up there in the driver's standings. Hamilton's trying to claw his way through. Um, and yeah, racing's racing. One thing we were told when I was marshalling back in the day is sometimes you just got to let them race. Yes, they'll bump, they'll ride each other a bit, but that's part of the sport as well, right? Um, was the penalty deserving? Probably not. Um, but it just seems like the theme for the past couple of races is, punching holes into side pods.
Yeah, it seems to be a Mercedes thing. It's like the Mercedes is designed to put holes into the Red Bull side pods. It's like
Yeah.
it's the one way we can disadvantage them. I mean, that's the tactic, right? Instead of trying to beat them on track, let's just try piercing a hole in their side pods because it really seems to hurt their overall performance.
The question I want to raise though, you said because Red Bull and Mercedes are involved. I'm curious to see what the penalty would have been like if it was like a Haas and a Alpha, or a Williams and an Alpine.
Yeah, yeah, that's another part of it as well. I mean, how much they take that into account, that it's sort of up to top class cars, and Perez you'd expect to be doing well, and same with Hamilton. So the fact that there is more on the line there, did they take it more seriously because of that? Did they give out a penalty because it was a more consequential incident, I suppose? And yeah, I mean, how much of that have they taken into account as well? Which is kind of wrong. Again, I think stewarding should just be pure, was Hamilton alongside far enough to make that move? Did he take an unnecessary amount of risk? Sorry, which is hard to judge. How how much risk is necessary, because they're always going. It's any overtake is a risk at the end of the day.
And
You've
they're
got
not in the
to
cup.
yeah. You got to let the drivers race though, and I think we're always talking about how the racing in Formula One is boring and there's no overtakes, and we get someone make a genuine attempt at a bold overtake like that, and we give them a penalty for it. So where's the encouragement there for racers to race each other? That's my concern with it. That it's like, if you're going to get a penalty for taking a bit of a move there, and it's not even like Lewis didn't dive or anything like that. He saw an opportunity, he had more pace, and he just went for it, and that's what racing is. So I think for me, that's the problem I have with it. Essentially, is that it's like I don't want to discourage people racing, and yeah. But anyway, I think we can move on from that one.
All right, so we're going to talk about more domestic stuff. We're going to talk a bit about V8 supercars. So there's been a lot going on in the category. So there's been some technical changes. So the throttle body for the cars have been reduced, particularly in the Mustang, reduced by, I think it's 7 mils, and that's to do a couple of things. It's to keep the rear tires from spoiling, because the Mustang have suffered from rear grip a fair bit. So they believe that reducing the throttle body and the engine performance with new mapping might help them out. But I still believe, I think the parity issues at the moment, and because supercars is such a unique category where they do run parity for some reason. It's yeah, they're trying to play catch up now. We had the aero fixed on the Mustang. Now we have the throttle body. We're getting into the endurance part of the the calendar, and Ford are being made to play catch up.
Yeah, it's a weird situation. It's weird that it's like it seems to be all something wrong with the Mustang as well. Like there doesn't seem to be any, um, you know, changes suggested to the Camaro, for instance, in order to bring it down. It all seems to be trying to bring the Mustang up. So they seem to be happy with where the Camaro is in terms of its performance and how it handles, and they don't want to sort of nerf, I guess you'd say, the Camaro. They want to bring up the Mustang to the same level. But yeah, it's interesting. Actually, not a bad point there in chat. Um, that they need to Dazu158 saying, they need to stop running down airport strips for testing and use wind tunnels. And yeah, I mean that's a big thing we should really be doing. I mean, wind tunnels are obviously pretty expensive to build and run, but we're a pretty small series, but surely they could work out some way that supercars could have its own testing, like its own tunnel, its own wind tunnel that all the teams are able to use at any particular time. And that could be a good solution to that in order to improve the parity of these cars, or even just using a wind tunnel for when they're testing new regulations or when they're testing a new thing. I mean, obviously, we're in a situation that we're not always going to be in every single year where it's a brand new style, it's a brand new types of cars, and it's not the same thing that we've been running for years and years and years, and it's very different. So there's always going to be those teething issues, and it really sucks that the teething issues are as bad as they have been, that it's one car that's really far down, even though they have made some pretty good strides as far as I've seen to bring it closer. Like the racing hasn't been too far apart. We have seen Fords sticking it up there with the Camaros a bit more often, but the Camaro is still seeming to have a big sort of lead at the moment. Yeah, it's one of those things. I mean, like I don't mind parity if it's built into the series, but it's this weird situation in parity we have in supercars where both manufacturers still want the car to be not just visually representative of the cars they're trying to sell to customers, but also mechanically somewhat related, that they both run their own engines, which is a big part of where we're having these parity issues, that we have those two very distinct engine types, even though they're basically the same, horsepower and the same capacity and all that kind of thing. But yeah, it's a tough one. I don't know. I'm sick of hearing about parity, so I really want them to sort it out.
We've been hearing about it for how many years now? You know, um, and this stems into the two next topics, right? This feeds into the two next topics. So obviously, if things do not work out and the Mustang comes to the level it needs to be, there's going to be consequences, right? Commercially, um, you know, and possibly even for the series. We had Paul Morris say on Speed Cafe maybe supercars shouldn't rely on manufacturers. And if that's the case, that's more or less putting the series back to Group A, sort of buy a car and jump in, right?
I think so. That's probably not. I don't know if that's exactly what he's suggesting. I mean, I'd love that, but I don't think that's ever going to happen again. I don't think we're going to get that sort of Group A, Group C golden era of the touring car series that we used to have. It's just motorsport's changed so much that kind of format works for, like, you have the production car series and you have a few other series that run similar-ish sort of things to that. But even you look at, BTCC, DTM, they're all running some sort of homologation. They're not really running like that standard homologation setup anymore. I mean, like DTM's entirely different to what it used to be. I mean, DTM used to be Audis and it used to be Astras running around with V8s and stuff like that. Like, it was this interesting little series with lots of different sort of manufacturers and things like that. So it's always going to be something that they're going to argue about. But I don't know, like, not having so much manufacturer interference could be a good thing. It could be something that does help the series if we just forget about any sort of, brand allegiance stuff and just go to some sort of spec car, similar to kind of similar to, I guess, what NASCAR does, where it is just sort of one car and there's no real difference between them. Mechanically, they are basically the same thing, and just use car manufacturers as sponsors. Similar to again what NASCAR kind of does, but yeah, it's a tricky thing. You either do that or you go full Formula One and just let people develop whatever the hell they want within some sort of regulation.
And going by the comment there, by Dazil once again, and that's going to be the next topic of what I was going to bring up. The Ford Motorsports chief is getting frustrated with the category, and has made public comments, which I can't recall what they were, but they're basically saying, "Look, pull your heads in a bit. Let's get this sorted." And there's been the commercial aspect already coming into it. Ford have pulled out the medical car, the safety car, and the fast lap, sponsorship sort of stuff. So that we're starting to see the consequence of this. And if this continues, I really don't know where it's going to continue going. I hopefully don't see this becoming a one-car series with Ford pulling out. But given the amount of money they've put in to develop Gen 3, I'm doubtful of that. But it's a bit of a worrying sight when one of the competing manufacturers is pulling out some form of support from the category apart from the actual racing outfit itself.
Yeah, I guess it's just up to how much do you want to maintain that old school rivalry that we've always had in supercars since the 90s. That idea of the manufacturer. I mean, the rivalry's always been there, even when it was touring cars, but we had other manufacturers in there. The whole Ford versus Holden thing, they're trying to redo that with, Chevy, Camaros and Mustangs.
It's not working.
It's a similar kind of thing, but like, I think without Holden there, and Ford being not really an Australian representation of Ford anymore, like it's not the Falcon anymore. Without that part of it, the whole two manufacturer rivalry thing, does it really work? Is it the thing that matters much to audiences in the series? How many Holden fans are really gunning for, Chevy now? When, I know personally as a Holden fan, I don't really follow the Camaros because I used to follow Holden. I generally follow teams and drivers and things like that. And I think you'll find a lot of people are probably like that when it comes to supercars now, because that local rivalry thing, it's kind of gone. It's kind of not there, and they're not really doing that anymore. So I guess it could be the best thing for it if Ford says, you know what, no, we're not going to do this. And they go, okay, well, what do we focus on now? Let's just make one car, maybe have different, shapes of bodies or something like that if you want to have that. Or you just have it as a kind of spec series where it is just one type of body car and it's all about teams and it's all about drivers. Personally, it sounds not super interesting to me, but
No.
the whole rivalry thing does add an element, but I mean, how important is it when it's potentially costing them, a lot of support from those manufacturers? You might get more manufacturer support if it's not focused on any particular sort of brand or style of car anymore, and then you might have other, motoring manufacturers wanting to sponsor and do a safety car and all that kind of thing. If you just have like silhouettes of whatever cars people want to put in there, you could have a silhouette of a Mercedes, or you could have a silhouette of a Camry or whatever. If those manufacturers don't need to put in anything other than, giving you the license to use their badge and their name on the car, maybe that could be a sort of a way forward. But yeah, it's tough because it seems like another kind of nail in the coffin for supercars at the moment. They're really struggling with a lot of those issues.
This is my solution, right? Supercars should be done with the manufacturers, and they develop their own car. Literally call it supercar, right? They specify the motor. It'll have its own body shape. It'll have its own drivetrain, all that sort of stuff. The teams can pool the resources together, or even have GRM develop it. GRM are doing what, half the field, or if not most of the field for TCR, the F5000s, and some other smaller spec races. Have them develop a supercar and then the teams buy it off them. Almost going the NASCAR route, but have it branded as the series brand, so that way we're done with manufacturers completely.
Yeah, I mean it's not a bad idea. Again, I've always said the strength of supercars, particularly in the modern era, is just the style of racing that it is. That it is still kind of unique. Where, if we keep the things about supercars that make it unique in the world of motorsport, which is the large engines, the big sedan bodies that can race really close together. They're not particularly high on downforce, so the racing can be, they can follow pretty easily. Still manual transmission, even though it's sequential now, still need a clutch. All those, no traction control, all those little things that make supercars different to something like GT3 racing, or even NASCAR. I mean, that this sort of thing kind of brings it closer to NASCAR, I guess. It would just be NASCAR, but they do more road racing. But I mean, if you looked at what NASCAR's been doing over the last couple of years, they've been doing a lot more road racing, because it's been bringing a lot more viewers than when they were just racing on the ovals. So it would sort of bring us closer to a NASCAR style thing. Again, Des was mentioning the TCR approach. I'm not sure. Do you know what
So
he means there?
TCR, it's a customer sport, so the teams will buy from the the manufacturer. So remember how we said a couple of podcasts ago that Audi's pulling out a TCR. So every team that's purchased an Audi, what's it, A2, I think A2,
Yeah.
will not have customer support anymore. They won't be able to purchase any new vehicles past a certain date. So that's how TCR work. But the funny thing is, from memory, TCR actually have their own car as well.
Right.
You don't see it too often, but they actually do have their own car.
Okay, it'll be something I'd have to look into. I haven't followed TCR that much as a format. But yeah, I mean, look, anything we can take from other formats. I guess the biggest thing for me is we got to make sure we maintain whatever it is about supercars that makes it unique, other than it being Australian, which I mean is a big thing, but it's not going to be the only thing that kind of brings people to the series. You have to make it distinct. Like I look at something like DTM now, and I struggle to find why I would watch DTM instead of GT3. Like, why not just run GT3 races? Like, the cars are so similar now. It seems kind of pointless running DTM as a separate series anymore, because it's just not what DTM was, which was, basically roided up hatchbacks, which was really good fun. It was the same as the Toka series, back in the 90s and stuff, and the BTCC and all that kind of stuff, like the, running, little hatchbacks around and all that kind of stuff. If you're going to run a series of motorsport and you want it to be world recognized and you want it to be international, you've got to make it unique in some way. You've got to make people be like, oh, I watch it for this. It's like GT3. People watch GT3 for a number of reasons, but one of them is the endurance racing side of it. They do a lot of endurance racing. The other things, obviously the cars that they use, being all the high class sports cars and things like that. People love their Lamborghinis and Ferraris, but they like to see sports car versions of them rather than sort of represented as a more related thing, I guess, in Formula One, because a Ferrari in Formula One isn't really anything to do with a Ferrari on the road, whereas GT3 is kind of closer to that, right? So there's an appeal to GT3 that I think is there, and there's appeal to NASCAR that I think is there as well. And again, at the moment, NASCAR and supercars are very close in terms of what they're offering audiences. And supercars, it's the worrying thing. It's like the more we go towards a spec series, the more we get rid of the manufacturer side of things. It's sort of in this weird place where supercars is kind of this hybrid between the NASCARs and GT4 almost. That's kind of what the cars are. They're kind of like GT4 cars without any assists and without and with a proper clutch pedal and proper sequential shifting gearboxes and all that sort of stuff. So I don't know. Supercars is in sort of a weird place, and I don't know. I worry. I worry about what they can do to keep it relevant.
Yeah, relevancy is always important because if you're no longer relevant, you're not having the people come through the gates and tuning in to watch your races anymore.
Yeah, it's especially internationally.
Moving on to the next piece. This is actually an issue that's been around for both cars this time, for both the Mustang and the Camaro, and that the steering rack issues they've had failures during the race. If you can you imagine, for example, going down the straight at Eastern Creek or Sydney Motorsport Park as it's known now, getting close to that left-hand sweeper and you can't turn left.
I
It's a
mean,
frightening prospect because it's one of the fastest corners in the country. Not saying it's exclusive to that particular race, but um, yeah, like it's happening every couple of rounds now. It's catching both makes out. When we saw the race out the other week out at Sydney Motorsport Park, and we saw, I think it was Reynolds parked in the last corner, but like really in field. And knowing the track myself, I'm like, that's a really weird spot, and they put it down to some sort of failure. They were being a bit quiet about it at the time. But that's a real safety issue. I really hope they got that sorted out because nobody wants to see anybody get hurt.
yeah, but I mean things like that. I mean, you're concerning, obviously, but things like that, I think, are just your natural teething problems you're going to have once you introduce a brand new concept of car to any sort of series. So, I mean, look at it. We saw it last year in Formula One with the porpoising issue, right? Like,
Yeah.
that was an issue they had to get on top of. With teams arguing because Red Bull's there like, well, we don't have any porpoising, so I don't know what you're worried about. But like other teams having porpoising, and some teams, allegedly hiding how much porpoising they were having in order to get an advantage in terms of speed and all those kinds of things. And especially when you get to that kind of level, you've got to look at sort of regulating it in some way so that people don't abuse it to any sort of degree, and you're risking the lives of spectators and drivers and all that kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, I don't classify it as a concern beyond the safety. Obviously, I think they've seen it now, and I don't think they're going to be able to ignore it. So I'm not too concerned about it as like a long term thing. I think they'll figure it out, and we'll just move on. And it's just a brand new format, brand new series. Let's just we're just gonna
The
have
the
those little
worry the
issues.
worry is for me though is that it's a control part. This is a
Yeah,
part that's supposedly being tested on road, off road, or on track, off track, um, and signed off and certified by the engineers at this company. Right? If we're having a continued quality assurance issue or quality testing issue, um, either find another supplier or have the teams develop that part themselves.
yeah.
Um, Moving on, this I found interesting that V8 supercars are abolishing the super license requirements. Their reasoning behind it is that the racing has changed and the procedures have changed so much that it almost makes the need for a super license void. I know a couple of drivers in the last year or so may have had some super licensing issues leading up to the endurance season that we're getting into now. Um, it'll be interesting because really in Australia, what's another method of getting a super license apart from going into Asia to race, some junior open wheel series and building up the points that way?
Well, I'm not entirely sure of the requirements here in Australia in regards to a super license. Like, um, supercars doesn't count as super license points, does it? Like, if you wanted to be in Formula One or something like that, you can't get super license points through supercars, as far as I know. So I wasn't even aware that we used the super license here in Australia, because it didn't seem that relevant. Not for supercars anyway. Like I'm sure for some of the junior formula, obviously the same way that everybody does.
Mhm.
Because I mean, really, super license. There's a degree of it which is getting into enduros like Le Mans and all that kind of thing, but there's also it's mostly about getting to Formula One. That's mainly where the super license comes into it. It's really IndyCar, Formula One, and the endurance series that use it. Like I can't say I've seen many I guess it's a way for supercar drivers to more easily get into something like Le Mans. But yeah, hard for me to comment because I don't know
Yeah.
that much about how
Well,
super license works here. Sort of
V8 Sleuth,
lightness.
who keeps tabs on what's going on in the V8 sphere, has reported, right, that Supercars has announced it will review how to move forward on driver eligibility following Motorsports Australia. So this was not a Supercars determination. This was Motorsports Australia, or CAMS as we used to know it, this decision to scrap its super license system. So this is Motorsports Australia saying, no, we're not going to do super license anymore. The super license, and this is quoted verbatim from the website, the super license currently required to race in the Repco Supercars Championship will cease to exist come the 1st of January next year. So apparently you required a super license to run in V8. It follows a string of changes which had arguably lessened the importance of a super license, given it was no longer the sole ticket into a supercar seat.
Yeah, right. So I guess Motorsport Australia, and that's sort of sounds right because I know they've been doing a lot locally to give us our own licensing and things like that. I have a Motorsports Australia license. I have an esports license, but it's a Motorsports Australia license, I suppose. But yeah, maybe they're just looking to replace it with something that's a purely local thing, so it's based entirely off participation in Motorsports Australia series. But I guess that would limit drivers' ability. I mean, looking from it from a driver's perspective, driver's ability to then go and race in other series. Maybe that's what they're trying to prevent. Maybe they're trying to stop drivers going overseas and stuff. But I think that would just discourage people from participating in supercars because it's like, well, I'm not going to get any license points out of it. It's not going to count on my super license. I've got to do other series if I want to go race in the World Endurance Series or something like that interests me, or if I want to, try and go to Formula One, which is pretty rare. Most people who are doing Formula One don't do any form of supercars. It's not really a line to get in there anyway. But yeah, it's possibly just a way Motorsports Australia can put more control over Australian racing, which is a trend that has sort of been growing locally in the last few years. So it's interesting. I have to look more into it, I think, because it could have some pretty serious repercussions.
Once again, Daziel coming through with the comment. I think it's because of the dramas that have happened over the years, where some teams wanted some 16-year-old, but they couldn't race due to the licensing structure. And that could be it. It could be that it's, stifling the talents of up-and-coming drivers. But like you said, Mike, it could be also them trying to control the export of drivers. We're seeing somewhat a potential mass exodus from supercars, with one confirmed driver going to NASCAR, another one running a NASCAR race, and then Cameron Waters up in the air whether or not he's going to stay or go. It could be a way to control exports, like you said.
Mm.
Speaking of, SVG and Kostecki are preparing for their NASCAR race coming up soon, and it's an oval race, so they're going to be driving a lot of straights and then turning to the left. Yeah, like some people are calling out saying, SVG wants to stick around next year. Let's give him hell. Let's bump and grind. Let's put him to the test and stick it to him a little bit. So that would be interesting.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's just going to keep happening, isn't it? I think we're just going to see more of our local drivers go over to somewhere like NASCAR. It's got more international appeal for them. It's potentially more exciting for them, especially someone like SVG, who's kind of set his dominance and place here in Australia, and potentially is just looking for more things. I mean, he's never been a driver who was, stuck in one series anyway. He's done a lot of other motorsports and done a bit of rally and all that kind of thing. And drivers who want to go grow their wings, and especially as supercars sort of gets less and less international attention, if you want to, go and experience things in the world of motorsport, you kind of got to look elsewhere. And NASCAR has definitely got a lot more international recognition. There's probably a fair bit more money in it, I'd assume, than in supercars. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to blame them. It's sad to see our drivers abandoning our local motorsport series, but I can't say I blame them for it because, yeah, I mean, the image of supercars has just been falling slowly and slowly away. You know, we kind of peaked, what, maybe 4 or 5 years ago was sort of the last time supercars was super duper relevant to an international audience, at least. Um, and now it's even less relevant to even local audiences. You know, most people aren't. You know, people. You still got your diehard motorsport fan, but we've lost a lot of them thanks to Holden exiting and thanks to Ford sort of no longer running the local cars and those kinds of things. It's yeah, it's hard to, you know. I wish them both good luck. They're both going to do well, I think. SVG's already been doing well in the races he's gone for. But yeah, I mean, there's so many reasons. We did that whole podcast. It was our first podcast about, you know, what's happening with supercars. And, you know, Daz was brought up, you know, in the chat there, obviously no longer being on free to air. I think that's an element, but it's also where that's kind of something that was a decision they made a long time ago that's hurt them. I don't think it's something they can necessarily reverse easily now. I think free to air TV is no longer as relevant. If they were going to try and be more accessible to a wider audience, they could probably do things like what the World Endurance Series does and what a lot of GT3 series do, which is just make it free on YouTube or something like that. I think that would be a really cool thing for supercars to do in order to get a bit more international recognition and audience. Like, you could watch the whole Nürburgring 24-hour for free on YouTube. You just watch it, like you just tuned in. I was watching the whole thing, Spa. You know, you can watch those races for free on YouTube's. But if you on YouTube, on the
interwebs.
on the interwebs. But if you want to watch a supercars race, you kind of have to, you know, if you're not in Australia, it can actually be a little bit tricky because, you know, there's not a lot of networks carrying it overseas. So you know, it's not something as readily available to an audience unless it's something like Bathurst or whatever, which is still always going to kind of get some viewership and is kind of the one thing I think that keeps supercars going, even in the Australian audience right now, because I mean, Bathurst is just a world-class kind of event, and there's nothing quite like the Bathurst 1000 in motor racing anywhere, really. It's just, there's something weird, there's something different about it that's still going to keep coming back, people coming back for more. But yeah, beyond that, I mean, I can't see our local drivers sticking around for just the regular season if it doesn't have that much appeal.
I think also the thing with supercars is, you know, we were there for a lot of it, right? We were there from the Invesco days through Project Blueprint, Gen 2, Gen 3. And I feel like part of the, and I might cop a bit of flack for this, a lot of the drivers aren't moving on. So we're having more drivers staying on longer contracts, staying with teams for longer. And we're having an issue where, because there isn't that higher rotation of drivers, whether it's between teams or new blood coming through, maybe the talent pool might have become a bit stagnant where, with nobody coming through, a lot of drivers are becoming dissatisfied.
Yeah, but like, what are they doing to attract that talent? That's the thing. What if I'm a race car driver, right? Like, if I'm, you know, 16 or whatever, and I want to race, you know, cars in Australia, I'm going to look at, I mean, you're going to look at supercars because it's like, okay, I could race locally in the supercar series, and that could be something to aspire to. But as a young kid, is that really what you're going to aspire to race? You're going to look at, maybe I'd be more interested in doing some of these other things that you see all the time. Like, you're going to be like, no, I'm going to do go-karting and try to get into open wheels and do Formula One, or I'm going to probably still do go-karting and try and get into world endurance racing, or something else that's just got more of that international appeal. And I say that, yeah, that sort of international appeal thing a lot, but it's it's because like if you're a kid, what motorsport are you seeing every day? You know, when we were kids, we saw supercars.
Yeah.
That's what was on TV all the time. You know, we also saw Formula One, but Formula One was on at midnight. You know, and
Yeah.
I mean, we
I
watched
was
it.
7.
Yeah, yeah, right. But you know, when you're kids, you're not always going to stay up that late to watch, you know, the Formula One races. You might, you know, see the replays on the news or whatever, but you didn't always do that. I mean, we do that now, but that's because we're sort of diehard Formula One fans. But, you know, kids are seeing all these different motorsports. I mean, now Formula One's a bit more accessible because, you know, we've got the internet and all that kind of stuff, but you didn't have that sort of exposure to other levels of competition. So supercar was really it, and that was the motor racing in Australia, and it was everywhere. And you could go to a local track, and there were more kind of local tracks before. So the kids are going to look at what they see on YouTube or what they see online, and what they're seeing online is not really supercars. It's World Endurance, it's GT3, and what they can play in games and stuff as well. I mean, video games obviously have a big influence on this, and Formula One's probably one of the biggest video games, as much as most sim racers would hate that, but it still is probably one of the biggest, you know, motorsport themed racing games there is, even if it's a bit rubbish from time to time depending on the release. But you know, but then they're going to look at, you know, even the more serious stuff, like, you know, like I said, of course, doing the GT3 racing. I mean, that's done wonders for making people more interested in GT3 racing, because, you know, it's a really good sim that obviously simulates just that one series really well, and that brings people in. It's pretty accessible. You know, I mean, iRacing obviously does supercars, but iRacing doesn't even do modern supercars. They still only do the old supercars. You know, they haven't modernized it, and they haven't caught up to date with the latest rules. And I can understand why, because there's probably not that much interest compared to a whole bunch of other cars they could be bringing into it. And I mean, they're adding rain now finally to iRacing, which is mad, because it's been how long and they haven't had rain. Finally iRacing adds rain, but that's a different topic for another podcast, I guess, because yeah, that's a whole thing. But yeah, like, you know, video games, all this sort of thing. Like, V8 Supercars used to be in video games when we were young as well. You had you know, the Race Driver series, which was like, if you're in, you know, Europe and the UK, it was Toka Race Driver. If you were in Australia, it was called V8 Supercars Race Driver, and they had supercars in there. Even if you got the British version of the game, they had V8 supercars in that game. You know, there was F1 Challenge and V8 Challenge, and there was representation there. But I mean, now you can't even drive any of these modern supercars in any sort of video game. So what access is a kid going to have to it? You know, I'd be very, very surprised if we even see supercars in something like Forza Motorsport, you know, the new one that's coming out, right? Which always used to have the supercars in the Forza Motorsport series for the last, you know, 10 years or however long they've had that series in there. So yeah, I mean, if it's not out there, how are people going to join it? And they're just going to be attracted to different types of racing.
And even driver progression, right? I remember in my younger years, right, it was obvious. You go and do karting, you'll graduate to supercarts with a gearbox, and then you'll jump into a Formula Ford. And the Formula Ford series was more or less global, right? You win the Australian series, you go race in Europe because it's the same car. Then you might get picked up by, I don't know, Formula 3, Formula 2, Formula 1. Or if you want to stay domestic, you jump into something that the kids won't remember these days, something called a Formula Hold.
Yeah.
Right? And you go progressively that way. There just seems to be a real shortcut these days to get everybody in a tin top, right? Yes, you'll start off in karts and maybe a supercar, but then it's from that, and you're jumping straight into a Toyota 86.
Yeah, you're going straight into, I mean, sort of sports car kind of racing, right?
Yeah.
Because they're not even like touring cars is almost a format that's dying in terms of motorsport, right? Like, the idea of a touring car race is just not as prevalent as it used to be, because I think, when I think of touring cars, I think of road cars modified to race each other. That's touring cars. When you go into something like GT3, it's sports cars, which is different to a touring car, because it's like a sports car is meant to be a fast car. A touring car was something like you look at BTCC, where they ran the Volvo wagons,
The bricks.
Yeah, that's touring cars. It's your average sedan, but racing. And we went through this already in the first one. The very first podcast, talked about the relevance of modern cars to racing. And I don't think there's enough association there anyway to have something like touring cars anymore, because cars these days just they're not built for racing. They're not designed around that. The cars that the average person drives are mostly SUVs, and I mean, unless we're going to do SUV racing, which I mean is someone must do that, but
supercars though.
Yeah, well, they do the truck, like the Rangers and the Utes, but they don't do like four-wheel drive racing. Like SUVs, like an MUX versus what's the Mazda?
Everest.
Yeah, that sort of thing. Like that's not a racing series, and that would be a touring car series these days, because that's the kind of cars that the average person kind of drives. They don't really drive Commodores and Falcons, or even estate cars and sedans anymore. They're just not as common. And now cars are going to be electrified or have some sort of alternative fuel. So, yeah. Look, I think supercars can't chase that rabbit hole anymore. World racing can't. I think you got to go with something like a GT3 sports cars style thing, or you've got to go with completely race car style stuff like NASCAR or Formula One does, and even to an extent supercars really does, because like supercars, even in its current format, is not representative of a Camaro and a Mustang. They kind of look like them, but they're not. The engines are pretty different. The bodywork is somewhat similar, but still pretty damn different to what those cars are. And they're not even relevant to our local industry that much. The Mustang kind of is, because you can get a Mustang pretty easily, but you can't buy a Camaro anymore.
Well, the problem is, right, and I've said this in the first podcast as well, Mustang starts at what, mid-60s?
Yeah.
Camaro, after it goes through HSV for the conversion, and because General Motors have come out and said publicly that they want to play the exclusivity game, only doing 100 or so cars a year, is upwards of 120 grand.
Yeah.
You're excluding anybody that can watch just for the racing, but not afford the car, right?
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, look, again, that whole relevancy thing, I just don't think it's that relevant to the conversation anymore. And yes, Desert, I know they use the road motors, because that's one of the biggest issues they have with the parity problem, is that GM wanted to use and Ford wanted to use some sort of representative engine. That was sort of their way in. But I mean, how relatable is what engine a car runs to the average audience? The fact that it runs, like, I don't understand why, other than just trying to do it as marketing, both Ford and GM are so obsessed with having their own engine in there. And Ford proceeding to make a mess of it anyway. Like, I still think the Mustang parity issue is Ford's fault. Maybe that's the Holden fan coming back in me, but I think it's Ford's fault for using a stupid engine for supercars, honestly. I think they picked the wrong engine. I think GM used the right engine. They used a stupid, simple pushrod motor and said, yeah, just go with it, right? Whereas Ford wanted to use a fancy, like Ford always do, they want to use some big fancy dual overhead cam, ridiculously over-engineered motor for racing, and it's like, what are you, Ferrari? Like, just don't over-engineer it. Just put a pushrod in there. Like, You can say the GM motor's dated. It doesn't matter. It works. It's killing it, right? They can't beat a push rod. There's no replacement for displacement, man. Like it works, and it's always worked it was a winning strategy back when Holden were running, Ford was struggling to keep up with Holden running a ridiculously simple LS1. It was just a push rod V8. That was it. That's all it did. The Ford motor doesn't last longer. The push rod lasts longer. You just got to make sure you keep putting oil in it. That's all.
Just remember, the Ford motors have caught fire 3 times this year.
Yeah, in the racing, that hasn't worn out either, has it? The Ford motors have had some issues. Although I don't think that was necessarily engine related. I think that was, I can't remember what that was. That was something else.
Oil lines or fuel lines or something.
Yeah, in the drivetrain, it was electrical. That's right. I think it was an engine thing, but we can call it that if you want. Like, I'm always happy. I'm still happy to rag on Ford. The Holden fan of me will never die. It's just impossible. But yeah, look, I don't have much more to say on supercars at this point. There's so many things, they're talking about, movements with drivers and stuff like that. And I'll always support the drivers. Like, it's cool to see that, they're potentially looking at Brown replacing SVG. That's interesting. Because SVG looks to be making his exit, at least anyway. I like Brown. We were there, actually. I always remember this. We were there for his first win, which is crazy. We were there at Eastern Creek. Awesome. I've got photos of him in front of the two, that I took in front of the 2 Red Bull cars. That was really just one of those lucky things to have been there for his first win at Eastern Creek that year. So yeah, I'm a big fan of Will Brown, so I wish him all the best. And there's a lot of good drivers and good talent in there, and I think that they deserve a bit more international recognition. And yeah, they've got to do something. But I think worrying about all this technical crap, all this parity, and all this sort of stuff, that's all just niggling little issues. They need to focus on doing
getting the racing right.
The racing is fine. That's still my argument. I think the racing in supercars is fine. I don't think they need to make changes to the racing other than, get the cars in parity or just scrap 2 manufacturers, whatever, one maker, don't care. The racing is fine. The car format and concept is good, but nobody can see it. It's a marketing thing. And maybe that's because I worked in marketing for so many years, but all I see is a marketing problem with supercars. I don't see a problem with the product. I see a problem with how they're advertising it and how they're making it appealing to any audience, local or international.
All right. So I promise you, Mike, this is the last thing we're going to talk about supercars, and we can get on to F1.
Noted.
This one is, I kind of like it. The drivers are, making a bit of noise saying, hey, look, if you're saying Sydney Motorsport Park is going to be a night race, run 2 night races. And I agree. If I can't make it there on the Saturday, why do I pay the same ticketed price and miss out and go to a day race on the Sunday, or if they run Friday, Saturday instead? I think good on them. If they want to market this thing as a night race, run the racing at night.
Yeah, no argument from me either.
Yeah.
I'm always happy to have more night racing. Sydney Motorsport Park is a good venue for night racing. So if they're going to do it somewhere, and the drivers do like the night race there, so yeah, I'm all for it. I like the daytime racing, but we do get daytime racing pretty much everywhere else. So yeah, but I don't know, I'm biased. I love night racing. I think night racing's awesome. The spectacle of it is just so much more intense, and you can have fireworks at the end, and from a spectacle perspective, I really like it. Some of my favorite races in any series are always at night. I love endurance racing because they usually go from night to day or early morning or something like that. Like the Bathurst, 12-hour starts at really, really early in the morning and then goes into the day and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, any more night racing they can do, I'm always down for it. I mean, even Formula One, Singapore's one of my favorite races. I love Singapore, and it's a night race, just because it looks interesting. It looks cool, Singapore might not be as interesting a race to me if it was during the day, and it didn't rain all the time, which is always what makes it fun, because it's Singapore.
All right, so we're going to move into F1 finally. We did a whole bunch of domestic V8, and we spent, close to an hour on it. So, Mike, you'd be interested in know. Williams has a new technical director.
They do.
They do. They got Pat Fry in.
Mm.
So what they're hoping is that Pat Fry comes through, and he'll bring a lot of stuff with him, which won't hurt Williams.
Well, it's always kind of been Williams's Achilles heel over the last, good lord, 10 years. It's been a while since I think they've had a really strong technical direction. Not necessarily good technical. I think they've had some good technical leads over the years, but I just don't think they've had a good direction technically. Like, you look at the car now, and the car as it is now is kind of how it's always been, even though, there's been regulation changes and they've updated things. The car concept hasn't changed a lot. The Williams car has always been low drag, really strong on straight lines, pretty rubbish in the corners. And it's just varies how rubbish it is in the corner from year to year based on the regulations and who's driving the damn thing. So having a new technical director is a promising sign that they're focusing on that aspect of the car, because it just feels like they've been not converting what they have into something that's, able to at least hit the midfield consistently. I mean, they've been doing pretty well this year, but I think a lot of that is because everybody besides basically Red Bull is struggling to really get their car concept figured out. So I think they're still just sort of picking up the pieces of the fact that Haas and Alfa Romeo Sauber have been struggling a bit this year. And haven't really got their car concept figured out or what they exactly want to do with it. Whereas Williams have a good enough car because it's strong in a good area and they know how to run it. And they've been 9 times out of 10 absolutely acing their race strategies. That's one of Williams' biggest strengths over the last couple of years is they seem to do really well on race strategy. I mean, like, they kind of fumbled it at Spa, and that was a surprise. Like, at Spa, they kind of fumbled up the race strategy and Albon ended up having to do an extra pit stop. Some of that was obviously due to the fact they didn't have any dry running in practice, really, to base their results off, because they had the sprint weekend, so they didn't have as much practice as usual. So they didn't really get to test the tyres where they were going to be good, and it turned out that the softs were not as good a starting option as they'd hoped. So yeah, but like, I don't know. It's a good sign for Williams, and I hope it does well for them. But yeah, I hope it's going the right way. But with everything that James Vowles has been doing with that team since he kind of took over, that's probably where I would hope he's made this decision on. And obviously, it's not just his decision, but that's where I hope the decisions come from, is a desire for a proper technical direction, and a way to make the most of what is reportedly some of the most limited facilities in the grid. Because Williams just apparently, despite being a sort of one of the older teams that's been around for so long, they have very limited aerodynamics facilities and testing facilities compared to even a newer team like who's only just sort of been increasing their dominance more recently, like Aston Martin. And a lot of that's just lack of investment, lack of results, and a lack of budget. So I don't know. Promising signs though.
That's true. For Williams, and you more than agree with me, the only way is up, right? They are gathering a bit of pace in terms of getting the car where they want it to be. They got a strong driver in Albon leading the team. Sargent hopefully starts coming into his own soon as well. And like you said, the technical direction has probably been missing for, dare I say, further than 10 years. And not being as equipped as what they should be is hurting them a bit. And, in some way, I wish that the sharing of technical information was allowed, or resources was allowed. So, for example, Williams could have access to Mercedes wind tunnel, since they're engine partners, but they can't share data or something like that. That would be nice to see. But that's my 2 cents on the Williams thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, my thoughts on sharing data between teams.
Yeah.
I'm not a fan of it. Personally, I think teams should be more distinct from each other than not. I think if you're an engine supplier, that's what you supply. You supply an engine and or a power unit these days. You supply a power unit. That's it. I think the level of sharing of parts between teams, while it's like, yeah, it helps smaller teams be competitive, it also, it makes
Lines the pockets of the other.
and it makes each team slightly less independent. You know what I mean? Like, I would prefer the teams to be more distinct. But maybe that's just a bit too much of a pipe dream, hoping for the '90s where we had, footwork and all these other weird and wonderful, one-shot teams that ran for a season or two and then died kind of scenario. I mean, even if we go back to 2009, 2010, when we had Virgin
Marusha,
and Marusha and
Patron.
Caterham and all those teams kind of come in after the GFC, and a lot of the big manufacturers decided to drop out. And we had that. Like, I miss the big grids as well, like 24 cars, I think, in that era, or more, 26, I think, at one stage there. That's what I'd like to see, more distinction between different teams rather than, kind of mashing everybody together into it's like, at the moment, sometimes it really does feel like there's, 5 teams and each of them has a sister.
Yeah. The other thing to touch on as well, we thought that the Nick De Vries departing or being asked to leave before the summer holidays was a bad thing. Alpine did the same thing with their team boss and sporting director. Literally announced it at Spa that they won't be there. See you later. Au revoir, being French. And they reckon the contender to take that spot is the previous Ferrari team manager.
Yeah. I mean, it's just Alpine these days, isn't it? It's like every season they just want to be, the silly season leaders. They just want to be the people who are in the news the most during silly season. We had last year with the whole Piastri fiasco and Alonso, and now it's the the party with getting rid of Otmar. Yeah, look, I never know what to think about Alpine, honestly. Even when they were Renault, they always seem to be a team since 2005, 2006, where they had the World Championships with Alonso. They don't seem to know what the team is for anymore. Like, they're an engine supplier that doesn't supply anybody else an engine. They only supply themselves the engine. Which is funny, me talking about everyone being more unique and then complaining about that. But they are, I don't know, they're always a strange team in the lineup, in that you expect them to perform better than they do, but they always sort of just middle about, 4th place, 5th place sometimes. They're just sort of in that mid-pack. They want to be winners, but they never seem to be able to convert any results. They've got good drivers. They've rarely had a bad driver lineup. Like, you look at, this year, they've got a really strong driver lineup. They've got Ocon and they've got Gasly. Both those drivers are very good and can win. They're both capable of it. So, they've had one good result here at Monaco, but we all know Monaco results are not always ones that count, because Monaco's its own unique kind of track. Not to take it away from them, it's still great for Ocon to have gotten that P3 there. But yeah, it's a weird, funny team that doesn't seem to know what it wants to do, and I have troubles looking at them and deciding what they actually are going to do and what their future is. It just seems like there's so much potential in that team that they don't understand how to convert, and other than them being French, I can't think of a good reason why.
I reckon, honestly, Renault should just cut their losses and pull out. Sell the team to somebody. As you said, they're their own supplier. They don't, after the last generation of Formula One cars, the Renault motor just fell away. You had Red Bull leave them. You had a number of other teams leave them, because they were supplying almost, a third of the field at one point. And yeah, like you said, they seem to have lost their way. They had the issue with Piastri. They had Alonso walk away from them. Even going as far back as the crash gate, because I feel that Renault had started to turn after Crashgate. They lost. They lost their way. They lost who they are. Right.
Mm. Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, they're this weird team that's the remnants of a few other teams of Benetton and all that kind of thing, and they had to sort of get rid of that. And it's you look at even the 2005, 2006 Renault, very different team to the Renault when say Ricardo joined the team.
Mm.
They were just a completely different outfit, and then they just make a lot of weird executive decisions. They got rid of, what kind of team gets rid of Prost? As your spokesman representative, it's like if Mercedes said, "Nah, see you later, Nicky Lauda. We don't need you. We don't want your support and advice and
What
your
do you know?
persona in our team." Because it was a very similar sort of thing. You had, Niki Lauda with Mercedes, you had Prost with Renault as sort of the old guard kind of guiding those teams in the future and being a good spokesperson for them and a good sort of head of the team for them. And they both, Niki Lauda stayed around for a long time until, life caught up with him eventually. But Prost was just exited from the team and just removed from there. And it's like, as someone who is so loyal to that team, even beyond where he should have been, Prost did a lot for French teams throughout his time after
He ran
Formula
one.
One, and he ran one, and it was not a pleasant experience then, and it never was a good idea for him. He should have just denounced his French citizenship, I think, and gone somewhere else, because being associated with France in any way after his Formula One career never really did him any favors.
No.
And it was a pretty typical end, I guess, to Prost's involvement directly with Formula One, getting ousted by Renault back a few years ago. But yeah, that it's just, I'm never surprised what comes from Alpine anymore, because I never know what they're doing, what to expect from them anyway.
Now we're going to talk about silly season, right? We're in the summer holidays. The amount of rumors I see pop up on the interwebs in your speak mic and the YouTubes
The YouTubes.
tend to be a bit out there. Some somewhat believable. The one that has me curious though. Stroll set to retire.
Yeah, what's the source for that though? Like,
Just
it's
just
just a rumor, right?
random thing that popped up on my feed.
I mean,
By like some backyard F1 guy.
I mean, I could see it happening, but I can't see why he would. I mean, he's on a good thing, right? Like, if you're Lance Stroll, you've got the best, easiest ticket in Formula One at the moment. You don't even really need to have results. You can have a bad season, and Daddy's still gonna let you have a drive for a little while. You know what I mean? Like, he doesn't need to be a top performer. I think if Aston were maybe closer to the front, more consistently, they sort of fallen off this season. Like if next year they were really vying for a championship and Stroll was letting him down, there might be some encouragement for him to retire, I suppose. And that would be the only reason I'd see him retire at all, is if he was sort of suggested it's like, hey, maybe you should just let it go, Lance, and we really want someone else to take your seat, but I don't want to fire you because you're my son. That's the only sort of reason I can see Stroll retiring. I think it'd be a good thing. I'm got nothing against Stroll. I don't think he's like the worst driver of all time or anything like that. He's just fine. He's perfectly competent. He does what he does. I feel like sometimes he just lacks the motivation needed. But that's also because he doesn't really need to prove himself every time he goes out. He doesn't feel like he's under a great amount of pressure ever. So sometimes he just sort of turns up and he's like, it was a bit of that was an okay race, I guess. Just sometimes just doesn't decide to show up, which in his position, I mean, it's hard to blame him for. He's just there, right? Yeah, I think it'd be good for the sport just because it would let another driver in, obviously. I think Stroll's had a good run. I think he could be proud of what he's done in Formula One, honestly. and it would be good to see someone else get that seat for sure, especially if Aston Martin sort of continues to kind of fight there at the top. It would be cool to see someone else partner with Alonso. But yeah, I'd want to see some more significant evidence of that before I really considered it.
See, my argument is, right, yeah, Dad runs the team, but eventually he would want to return on that investment, right?
Well, yeah.
You know, he's spending money on new headquarters out at Silverstone, decking that place out. He has Alonso for at least a couple of more years. If you're spending the money to be in the sport, put the sport first. You know, I can guarantee you now, at a point, staff are going to get complacent, as in with development and all that sort of stuff, and they'll start building resentment towards Stroll because there's no gain from him, right? Really, the team is supporting one driver to go out racing because Dad runs the team, and then supporting another driver technically to push that car forward. Albeit that, you know, Alonso hasn't had a great, you know, coming to the end of this first phase of the series. But I just feel like you said, it will be a good call. He's had his go. He's outlasted some drivers that probably deserve to be. And that's what I reckon.
Oops, sorry. Just had to cut out there. Sorry. Sorry.
But that's my 2 cents.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it was interesting. I mean, looking today at I had it come up today actually, which I thought was really interesting. If you look at, let me find. There it is. So I was looking today at all the drivers who have and don't have a seat for next season, basically. So driver lineup for 2024 that's confirmed at this point. I mean, this could change. So you got Verstappen and Perez are still confirmed next season. People still got a rumor that Perez is going to lose his seat, but he's contracted for next season, so we can assume that. Stroll and Alonso still confirmed. Norris and Piastri also confirmed. Albon's confirmed. Bottas is confirmed. Russell's still confirmed. Leclerc, Sainz, Gasly, Ocon. They're all going to stay in the same seats that they were in, assuming nobody buys out their contract. They've all got seasons for 2024. Signatures for 2024. Now, of that, you can look at some of the drivers that don't necessarily have a contract yet, but are probably going to re-sign. So someone like Hamilton, for instance, doesn't have a contract, but Hamilton's just kind of year-on-yearing it at this point. I think he'll continue to sign with Mercedes. I can't see him going anywhere else, and I still don't think he's up for retirement yet, but maybe we'll see how the rest of the season goes. But I dare say we'll see Hamilton for at least another year. You've got both Haas drivers. Who knows what Haas does with their drivers? I mean, I'd say Magnussen's probably made a pretty good effort of it, but is the one most at risk. Whereas Hulkenberg, name escaped me there. Hulkenberg has definitely been the clear driver with an advantage this year for Haas. So I could see them re-signing Hulkenberg. And I kind of hope they do, because I think he's been doing really well and he deserves a seat still, despite his age and all that kind of thing. But I think he can do really well for Haas still. I think he's a good, reliable driver. And I think mostly the same about Magnussen. But his performance this year has been, he's sort of dropped off a lot. And how much of that's the car and how much of that's the driver themselves, who knows at this point. AlphaTauri is, who knows, it's a Red Bull junior team, right? So Tsunoda is a really good driver who I think deserves a seat, but Red Bull will be Red Bull. They could easily just be like, no, we'll get Liam Lawson or someone else in. We just, no, go away, Yuki. You know, you've had your time. You're done. In which case I can't see anywhere Yuki might move to. And And then obviously Ricardo's in the second seat at the moment. Whether he stays or not is up to performance, up to his own options, whether or not they do decide to move him to Red Bull or they move Yuki to Red Bull. So I don't know. I wouldn't be taking bets on what AlphaTauri decide to do next year. I think Logan Sargent will get another run next season. I think they'll re-sign him. I think Logan's been doing a good enough job for Williams in their current state. I think he's been performing pretty well, considering he's a rookie and all that kind of thing in a not particularly high class car as far as the field goes. So yeah, I reckon Williams will re-sign him because I can't really see anybody else they would sign instead as well. Like I think there's no other driver on the grid that Williams could get, and there isn't really a junior who stands out that Williams would attract, I guess, and has been sort of breeding up. And then the other one is Zhou, who, Zhou's a tough one. I don't know about Zhou Guanyu because I think he's a really good driver. I think he's done very well. I mean, really good qualifying at Hungaroring. The race didn't go well for him, but considering his level of experience, and we all have bad days, and that was a bad day for Zhou. But he's clearly got pace, he's clearly got performance, and given that the car isn't that great, like honestly, I think Zhou's got more right to be in that seat than Bottas does. I like Bottas. Bottas is cool. He's a fun dude. He's always been good. And he's always been a good driver. But I think his time in the sport is kind of done. And I feel like kind of he's sort of similar to Stroll, I guess, in a way, where he's sort of just taking up a seat that maybe someone else should get a shot at. But yeah, I mean, that's the current standings. What do you think? Any movements you can see?
Funny you mentioned the Bottas thing, right? So there was another rumor that I saw, and it was repeated on a couple of websites actually, that Science has actually signed a understanding of agreement with Audi.
Yeah.
Now, if that's the case, right, there is a family connection because his father races rally still. He done Paris to Dakar with Audi, and there's that history there. Maybe it could be a case that when Sauber convert to, or Sauber Alfa Romeo convert to Audi, that maybe Bottas retires and Sainz takes that space, which to me sounds quite logical. To be honest with you, I'm quite excited for Audi. It's nice to see another manufacturer. Hopefully maybe in the future they'll bring their own power plants as well, which would be pretty neat. And yeah, that's for me, that's the silly season stuff. Leclerc is going to stay because he has this weird loyalty with Ferrari, even though they do weird things to him. He's going to stick around.
Well, where else can he go realistically? That's the thing with Leclerc that everybody brings up, right? It's like people are like, oh, he should move on. Ferrari's no good for him. It's like, yeah, but where else does he go? Where is he going to go? He can't go to Mercedes unless Lewis decides to retire. Like, if Lewis retires, and Lewis is another one who it's like, maybe Lewis should just retire so that we can get a new driver in, right? Like, but it's harder with Lewis because I think, I'm like, say Bottas, right? I think Lewis is still driving at the same level he's been at for ages. Like, he's still pushing it, right? Like, we've seen it in the results this year in a car that's still not the class of the field, and not even the second fastest car, even on the weekends where it's coming P2, right? Like, Lewis is doing good things with that car. And I think Lewis in a Red Bull, for instance, would be absolutely smashing it. I don't think he's lost it. I think his motivation's still there, and he wants that record. He wants that 8th victory, right? I don't know if it can happen. I don't think Mercedes can catch up in time to give it to him, which is unfortunate. But I also don't see him sort of chasing it with another team either, because I think he's so invested in Mercedes that he's going to end his Formula One career there for sure. But yeah, it's a thing. Like, Leclerc could go to Mercedes if Lewis decided to retire. That's one place he could potentially go where he might be better suited. I think Leclerc at Mercedes would actually be a really good match. I don't think Leclerc suits Ferrari at all. I think Leclerc, as sad as it is, I think Leclerc is destined to be He's destined to be like a bit of a Kimi.
Yeah,
Um, you know, a Kimi Räikkönen story, except not actually able to get a world championship like Kimi finally did. Because those years where Kimi was at McLaren, it's very similar. I see a lot of similarities between Kimi Räikkönen at McLaren and Charles Leclerc at Ferrari. Those drivers should be winning more, but they're just being let down by the team they've got at the time. And Ferrari and both Ferrari and McLaren very similar in these two different eras that they're in. McLaren were just unreliable piece of junk car that barely worked half the time. When it did work, it was fast and you could win races with it, but most of the time it didn't. You know, and it's a similar story too, where it's like, you know, Leclerc is, I think, absolutely one of the best drivers in the world, but so is Max Verstappen, and it's the same thing as like Kimi Räikkönen. Kimi Räikkönen was one of the best drivers in the world, an unquestionable talent, but so was Michael Schumacher, and they were just in the same era at the same time. So it's that similar sort of thing. I mean, where you've got so many world class drivers at that same point in time, it's tough for someone like Leclerc who's just not in the right situation, but he really doesn't have anywhere better to go.
that's true. I reckon maybe he has a chance where in a couple of years' time, Andretti and there's a second team do come through, because they're looking at expanding the field by two, and they're the two favorites at the moment. So maybe he will find himself at a new team where he can actually drive the development of the car. Whether or not he's willing to take that career risk is another thing. But yeah, it pains me to see, like, you could see the Ferrari photos I have behind me. I'm not a Ferrari fan, but I like their cars and their history behind them. But it just pains me to see him struggling. Not, we're not talking like has struggling, but struggling to get to where he deserves to be. Whether it's due to people running into him, um, retirements, or just some weird strategy calls. It's through no fault of his own, and that for me is the frustrating bit.
Yeah, and I think any Ferrari fan is going to say exactly the same thing. Or any just general Charles Leclerc fan, because I'm not a Ferrari fan either, but I'm a Charles Leclerc fan, and I think, yeah, it's just he's just racing against such a supreme talent in Max, and then there's all this other talent coming up as well, and you got to, age is such a big factor now. It's like, but you can look at something like, Leclerc could take a similar route to what Lewis Hamilton did, where Lewis Hamilton was with McLaren, which at the time was, sort of race winning, similar-ish, I guess, to Ferrari, as they are now, but wasn't the most reliable and couldn't give him all the results that he wanted. I mean, he got one world championship out of him, but he didn't get everything out of him that he thought. And he went and invested his time and took the risk on Mercedes. So Charles could find that team, with the next set of regulations in 2026 when the new engines come in and we have Audi joining. He could join someone like Audi or another manufacturer like Andretti or something like you were saying, and that could be it. And I think that's probably got more potential for him than doing something like a Ferrari. But it could also be that it's the thing you see with Leclerc. It's like, he's such a modest man. Like, he's such a nice guy, Charles Leclerc. Yeah. And sometimes I worry he's too nice of a guy for Formula One to win. Because it's like, Max is not an asshole. I'm not going to try and portray him that way. But he stands up for himself, and he's got a backbone. And I feel like he's got a little bit more of that backbone that you kind of need that. You need to be forceful. I mean, we see it in a comparison even between Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz. Like, Sainz has got that little bit more backbone. He's got a bit of that Spanish fire, right? So he will sort of stand up for himself on strategy calls, and he will speak out against the team a little bit more. And perhaps some of that is just because he's the second driver, so he can kind of get away with it a bit more than Charles Leclerc does. And Sainz also kind of owes less of his career to Ferrari, whereas, Charles Leclerc owes a lot to Ferrari. He's kind of been with them since he was a junior, so he's always been part of that kind of Ferrari family. So there's going to be that side to it and that factor in there and that kind of loyalty. But I don't know. I don't think there's much more we could say. It's just it's a sad situation that he's in.
Only time will tell.
Yeah, and that's really it with Charles.
Alrighty, I think that covers everything, right?
Look, there's so much. I mean, yeah, it's been a long one. It's what happens when you miss a week. There's so much racing happening. I mean, we didn't even cover, Eastern Creek race, which was good, by the way. I thought it was a pretty good race. Eastern Creek's always pretty good. Lots of drama in that race. Few couple of interesting penalty calls. It's funny that there was that a similar sort of thing where there was kind of that racing incident towards the end with Brown and it was Brown and SVG, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I couldn't believe.
Let's touch on it, right?
Yeah. All right.
So for those that don't know, SVG done a bit of his trademark on Brown, where he just bumped him in the back and then bumped him again. I think there was a count of 2 or 3 bumps on the rear while going into a braking zone and around the corner on the final lap. The marshals and the stewards, that's the word I was looking for, went, yeah, no, that's not cool. 5-second penalty, and he didn't find out until he went to walk up towards the podium. Supercars went, no, mate, turn around, you didn't finish third, you got a 5-second penalty, which gave Brown the spot, which in a way, look, I've seen Shane race, and it is a bit of his move. I kind of agree with what happened. Like at a point, a line needs to be drawn in the sand, right? Where there's potential danger in what he did there. I don't mind if it's like back and forth, like for example, what we saw between Ingle and Scaife at the same track many years ago. There were biffing and barging between them. But to go into a guy at a braking zone and continuously tap the back of him to then get the advantage to overtake, I'm like, I don't know.
I mean, from my perspective, I look at it much more the same way I look at the Hamilton and Perez incident. I look at it as that's racing, especially touring car racing. That's what makes touring car racing. You're supposed to be able to bump each other. A bit excessive, maybe, but you want them to race. You want it to be. I don't think anything SPG did there was particularly dangerous. Like it wasn't out. I don't think there was much outside the regulations from my perspective. He was just racing. He wasn't, he didn't push him off the track. He just sort of pressed the advantage and, maybe more contact than necessary. And I don't necessarily think a penalty's entirely outside of possibilities. I think he should have been warned first.
Final lap in like the last 2 or 3 corners.
Well, that's the thing. It's like it's the last lap, and he's sort of trying to push an advantage, and maybe that's what influenced the decision. Where they're like, we don't want to reward people taking that kind of risk on the last lap, and I can kind of see that. That's what they want to try to discourage it from. Don't do risky things on the last lap, and don't push that advantage to that extent. So I can understand them doing it from that perspective. But looking at the incident on track, like when I saw it, I'm like, what's he doing wrong there? He's just giving him a couple little kisses on the rear end. Like it's racing, that's fine. Like that's what these cars are designed to handle that. They're designed to be able to make that kind of low speed contact. And like Will Brown got psyched out of it. He didn't, I'm a big Brown fan, but he got psyched out of it. He didn't get pushed away. I don't think him being overtaken was because of the contact. I think it was just more psychological warfare at that point rather than the actual, punting itself. So it's a tough one for sure, and I think more marginal, say, than Perez and Hamilton, which I think absolutely was not a penalty. But I think a similar sort of scenario where it's like, we don't want to discourage racing. You know, we don't want to discourage a little bit of biff and barge, because it's a bit exciting and it makes it interesting to watch. And I want to see people passionately racing each other. I don't want them to be worried about getting a penalty and not taking a little bit of a risk every now and then. I don't know. And I'm not an SVG fan either. I think sometimes he is too aggressive. Like, don't get me wrong, but in this particular instance, it may more be his reputation that hurt him than the actual incident on track, which, you know, does happen. I mean, we saw that with Max a few times in 2021, where there were some of the things he got penalized for that were not particularly bad, but a lot of it was you're a Max Verstappen and you're kind of aggressive when you're racing other people, and you need to sort of settle Max. So maybe there's a bit of that in there too.
Maybe. Anyway, I think we'll leave it at that, because I reckon we can keep on talking for more and more hours.
Always.
So as always, guys, without volunteers, there isn't racing. So if you want to get as close to the action as possible, have a chat with your local racing club, track, or racing association, whether that's Motorsports Australia or the other bunch. I'm sorry, I think it's AMSA. And volunteer. It's as close as you can get. You make great friends. And in some cases, there's even a barbecue at the end. So, you know, can't say no to a snag and a roll.
Yeah, that's it. We always want to encourage people to support local racing in whatever format, and don't just do it for the obviously the mainline supercars and stuff. You know, go do it for all your local events. If there's a track near you, I'm sure you can find somewhere where you can volunteer. I mean, we're motorsport fans. Who doesn't want to just hang around cars for a day, you know? And to do it in a way that helps the industry, I think is, yeah, good. And we should encourage it. But yeah, that'll do it for this week. Bit of a menagerie of topics this week. A little bit sporadic, but we got through it. Next week we will return. Probably Monday. I'm going to say Monday. I'm going to say Monday night. I'm going to try and make Monday nights the regular night, but we'll see with my schedule how that works. But yeah, always try and do one per week, and we'll have something a little bit more focused and specific that week, because there's a little bit less news going on at the moment, so it does mean we can focus on some topics that interest us within motorsport, be they current events or more historical stuff. And I love talking about the historical stuff, so I want to get into some of that. All right. Yeah, that'll do us. Thank you, everybody, for joining in, everybody who participated in the chat. Yeah, don't forget to follow, subscribe, all that good stuff, and check out the YouTube where you can watch the full podcast replay, or you can catch the Twitch VOD if you want, but it'll be up on YouTube for a lot longer, because Twitch doesn't like to host videos for more than 3 months. Yeah, thanks everybody for tuning in, and we'll catch you all next time. Bye for now.
Stay safe.